The migrant crisis moves inland as Hungary announces plans for a 4-metre-high fence to stop the flow of migrants and to protect its interests. But will building a barrier on its border contain the problem or just push it elsewhere? Europe's ongoing migrant conundrum. This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamal Santamaria. It would be a bit of a stretch to call this a return to the Cold War era that separated communist Eastern Europe from the capitalist West. But having said that, a country planning to build a 4-metre-high, 175-kilometre-long security fence along its border, well, there is a certain image and mentality which accompanies that. And so we have Hungary proposing that very scenario. It says to stem the flood of illegal migrants trying to enter. And there's no apology with it. This is necessary, it says, to, quote, protect Hungarian interests. And even these measures may not be enough. Just to put this on the map to start with, Hungary is a landlocked nation of 10 million people right in the heart of Europe. Most migrants heading there from the Middle East and North Africa end up crossing its border with Serbia. And this is where, as you see highlighted in yellow, the fence would be. Government figures show more than 53,000 people have requested asylum in Hungary so far this year, which is up from 43,000 for the whole of 2014 and just 2,150 back in 2012. So Hungary's position isn't an easy one, but the United Nations Refugee Agency has condemned its response to it. It talks about Hungary's harsh border enforcement measures, saying the barrier would be, quote, a further obstacle for people who have fled from war zones like Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq, and who desperately need safety and protection. And it's those people's stories we will start with today, the migrants on the border between Hungary and Serbia, who've been talking to our correspondent Jonah Hull. Have a look at this report. Our discussion will follow.
They could be tears of pain or relief or exhaustion. For more days than many can count, they've travelled, crossing borders by any means, fleeing civil war in Syria for the safety of the European Union. This is the welcome they get.
Yes, you're a refugee, I see. Yes.
Another group arrested, this time from Pakistan. They've just walked from Serbia into Hungary, the latest leg of a shattering 2-month journey from Islamabad. Where do you want to go to?
Go to Italy, Spain, Germany.
Why?
Working.
In good weather, hundreds a day might cross over into the pretty Hungarian border town of Vasothalom. The dense forest provides good cover here, and most escape the local rangers who follow their tracks through the woods. The Hungarian government plans to build a 4-metre-high fence to seal this 175-kilometre stretch of border, something the mayor of Vasothalom describes as a new iron curtain, a necessary solution to stop the influx of what he says are mainly Muslim asylum seekers.
We are talking about a totally different culture. We are talking about a Muslim culture, about a world that will collide with our European Christian civilization.
The rangers are the mayor's men, few in number but answerable to him with police powers and weapons.
I'm not happy about the Iron Curtain because I will see it from my farmhouse. I feel like I'm in jail, but it is necessary because what I'm worried about is that this migration will push Hungary into a conflict, into terrorism and tension.
These people hardly resemble terrorists. This man from Cameroon lost his sister and her 2 daughters in the chase. I tried to explain that we believe they were captured a little earlier and that he'll be reunited with them soon. So they've made it into the European Union, only just into the European Union. This group of men from Syria, women and children, are also in the police van. They're all in the hands now of the Hungarian police, and they'll be handed over shortly to the immigration authorities who'll decide whether to grant them asylum or not. Most of these people will be housed in an open refugee camp, able to come and go, which means that most will resume their journey westwards, soon to become another country's problem.
Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, southern Hungary.
So let's introduce today's panel to discuss this other side of Europe's migration problem. Joining us via Skype, first of all, from Budapest is Gabor Gyulai, who is a refugee program coordinator at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. Welcome to you. In Oxford, Jeff Crisp, research associate at the Refugee Studies Centre, Oxford. And in London, Gabor Gyulai, who is a barrister at Garden Court Chambers. He specialises in human rights, asylum and immigration law. Gentlemen, welcome to all three of you. I would like to get a quick word from each of you, first of all, on the idea of a fence. A fence on the border between Hungary and Serbia. What would it really achieve? Gabor, let's start with you.
First of all, a fence would not achieve anything, or it would not solve anything. The number of asylum seekers have multiplied in Hungary in the last 2 years, I should say spectacularly, by 50 at least. That's why the government wants to build a fence to keep the asylum seekers out. However, from a legal point of view, or from a human rights point of view, this is something that is completely unacceptable. The fence will be built on Hungarian soil, so those who are climbing over the fence, who want to get access to Hungarian territory, will already be on Hungarian territory. In this respect, all of Hungary's international obligations apply to these people. So in legal terms, this fence will not stop anything. In practical terms, we have seen it in other examples as well, in Bulgaria or Greece, that asylum seekers who are fleeing war, they just go around this fence. They are not really effective in keeping people out.
Jeff, let's move to you. What do you think? Do you agree with those sentiments?
Well, I very much agree with what the earlier speaker said. There's nothing particularly new about the idea of building fences in order to keep people out. Of course, the Mexico-US border has been very heavily fortified for a number of years, with the precise intention of keeping out unwanted foreigners. As you've already said, the same has happened recently on the Bulgaria-Turkey border, and now Hungary is proposing to do exactly the same thing. But I would agree very much with the previous speaker that these are sometimes an exercise in futility. Perhaps they're done for primarily political and symbolic purposes. If you go to the Mexico border, for example, which is one of the most heavily fortified borders on earth, you will still find Mexicans queuing up to get across every night, despite the very evident dangers that confront them as they try to make their way across. And I'm sure the same thing will happen with the proposed border between Hungary and Serbia. Similarly, experience has shown in many different parts of the world that if you build a barrier to keep people out, it usually diverts the flow. It doesn't prevent the flow because people are still leaving conflict, persecution, violence and poverty. And so they will find a way, whatever obstacles are put in their way. So I don't think putting a 4-metre high fence along the border between Hungary and Serbia is going to keep people out.
And Greg, a quick opening thought from you as well on this fence idea.
Well, I'd have to agree with Jeff and Gabor as well. I think the first thing you have to remember about these people is that they're fleeing persecution. You're talking about people fleeing extremely dangerous situations. So they're very desperate, and that desperation isn't going to go anywhere. And it's also worth recalling that this kind of idea cuts against the principles of the protection of human rights and the protection of refugee rights that are enshrined in the European Convention, as well as the EU directives and the EU treaty.
Okay, so it looks like we all agree that the fence is not a great idea. I actually like Jeff's phrasing there where you called it an exercise in futility. Why don't I come back to you, Jeff? If it's an exercise in futility, then why do it? Or can we look at it, at least from the point of the Hungarian government, as saying they've got to do something? They want to do something, and a physical idea of a fence there seems like a good deterrent.
I think there are two things happening, and Hungary is by no means the only country that's been affected by this kind of attitude. One is a lack of understanding of the very powerful forces that are driving people across the world to try and find safety and better conditions of life in other parts of the world. If somebody's come from Syria or Eritrea and made it all the way to the Serbia-Hungary border, they're not going to look at the fence and simply say, OK, I'll turn around and go back then. That's not human nature. So it's a lack of understanding about the very powerful forces forces that are driving people to leave. But it's also, I think, as I said, an exercise in political symbolism. Governments want to show that they're doing something, and erecting a fence looks good on TV. Perhaps it convinces some of the voters, some of the constituents, that the government is actually serious about doing something, even if those people don't really understand that it is, as I've already said, an exercise in futility.
OK, you've all mentioned some of these other fences, and I think it's a good point just to tell our viewers a little bit more about them, because as we've pointed out, the Hungarian government is insisting it's not the only country which wants to fortify its borders in these ways. You've got Bulgaria, which completed its 30-kilometre fence along its border with Turkey last year. It's got plans to extend that. Further south, Greece has built this fence along a 12-kilometre stretch of its border with Turkey. That was finished in 2012. You've also got the Spanish enclaves of Melilla and Ceuta, which have barriers that separate them from the rest of Morocco. Those are built to stop immigration and smuggling. Gabor, why don't I come back to you in Budapest? Has there been any level of success in those ones, to your knowledge, of, well, maybe I won't say success, but in doing what the governments wanted them to do?
I think we should definitely keep out or treat a bit separately the situation in Ceuta and Melilla in the Spanish enclaves.
Okay.
These are small cities that you can actually protect or seal down completely with a fence. So I think it's not really directly relevant. What is really relevant is to see what happened on the Turkish-Greek and Turkish-Bulgarian border. And if you just look at the numbers, either by the illegal or irregular border crossings by Frontex, for example, or you look at the numbers of asylum seekers in Greece and in Bulgaria, you see splendid examples of how ineffective these fences are. For example, a number of asylum seekers in Bulgaria has been continuously increasing for several years. The wall didn't change anything on that. In Greece as well, the number was stagnating in the last few years, and this year it again went up spectacularly. What happened in Greece, that the construction of this wall in the Evros region reduced irregular migration in that particular region. However, it forced all the asylum seekers and other irregular migrants to use the seas, to approach Greece through the sea, which is much more dangerous. There is much more risk of serious human rights abuses, or even death at sea. On the other hand, if we compare this to the specific geographical situation of the Serbian-Hungarian border, we cannot predict, or I wouldn't predict that this would by any means more effective. This is in the middle of a continental piece of land. Asylum seekers will just be able to go around the fence and will be able to approach Hungary and go on towards Western Europe through Romania or Croatia.
Greg, if not a wall, then what? And we're going to get more into this, into sort of policy discussions and things like that about what can be done across the whole European Union. But in the specific situation of Hungary at the moment, if not a wall or a fence, then what?
Well, I think if anyone knew the answer to that, they would have suggested it. But I think the problem here in terms of, if you accept that there is a problem with large numbers of people arriving in order to claim asylum, that problem isn't going to be resolved by problems in Hungary or by a solution in Hungary. There's going to need to be a pan-European solution. And I'm not convinced the solution is necessarily going to be achieved in Europe either. What you've heard from the earlier speakers is obviously correct. When you build a wall, you are forcing people to take different routes. That's what's driving people into the Mediterranean. That's what results in large numbers of people drowning. And that's why we're seeing the corpses of children on television. If there's going to be a solution to this, I think realistically the only thing to do is either stabilise the situation in North Africa, or you need to have a system whereby refugees are allocated throughout the European Union, maybe on the basis of how many people that can be taken per capita.
You said
I just don't think that a single country can bring about a solution.
Sorry, Greg, you said, I just jotted it down here, if we accept that there is a problem. Well, let's do that. Let's accept that there is a problem. And again, I'm taking the side of the Hungarian government here just to play devil's advocate. They do have a problem. They've got a lot of people wanting to come into their country. They are a small, poorer European nation on the periphery, and they can't take this too much longer, which is why they're resorting to these sort of drastic ideas.
Well, certainly that's what they would say. I mean, what I would say in response to that is that you have to remember that the people you're talking about are fleeing persecution, they're fleeing appalling histories in the countries from which they come. You're talking about Syrian refugees. I've had many clients who've arrived in the United Kingdom via Hungary or via Italy or Greece, who've come originally from places like Syria, who are telling us about appalling things that happened to them, and then they end up facing really poor treatment in places like Hungary or Italy, and the possibility of removal from London, for example, back to that situation. So I think the first thing to bear in mind is that Hungary, like the other European states, has signed up to the Refugee Convention, has signed up to the European directives, and as first world countries, we ultimately have to accept responsibility for dealing with the people who arrive on their shores in need of protection.
Gabor, a quick word from you before we move on, because you wanted to say something there.
Yes, I think it's really important to keep in mind that we can't take out this issue from the particular Hungarian context at the moment. It's true that numbers have gone up quite significantly, but it's also true that over 90% of the asylum seekers who come to the European Union through Hungary move away from here very fast. In 1, 2, 3, 5 days, they already cross the border irregularly towards Austria or other directions. So currently at the moment, as far as the Hungarian Helsinki Committee is informed by the authorities, we have about 3,000 asylum seekers at this moment in the country, while until now already 60,000 have applied this year, which shows really the very high level of turnover. Having such high number doesn't mean that they stay here. I think it's also very important to consider that I agree with the previous speaker that Hungary, as a signatory state of the relevant international conventions, as an EU member state, has to absolutely accept and assume all its responsibilities. However, I think this situation clearly shows the fundamental issues around the so-called Dublin system and the whole system, how asylum seekers and responsibilities for asylum seekers is currently determined under EU law, which I think it's fundamentally erroneous and problematic.
Right,
and
Gabor,
this is a need for change.
Let me stop you there, because you've said the magic word there, and that is Dublin 3, and this is something we need to explain to our viewers here, because this is the other part of Hungary's actions. I want to bring our viewers up to speed with this. As Gabor was saying, something called the Dublin Rules, Dublin 3, Dublin Regulations, whatever you want to call it. These state that a migrant's asylum claim must be dealt with in the EU country in which they first arrived. So they might have gone somewhere else, but this asylum claim needs to be dealt with where they first arrived. Now, you've also got, we'll mention these other things, the so-called Schengen area, 26 European countries, including Hungary, in which you can travel freely without a passport. So Hungary is effectively saying, you let people into Hungary, you let them into the whole of Europe. And there is also, we'll talk about this a little bit later, a European Commission plan to distribute migrants more evenly across the EU. Hungary's Prime Minister has said that, and this is a quote here, borders on insanity. Jeff Crisp, let me come to you in Oxford. Let's talk about Dublin 3 first of all. Now, Hungary's original plan was to say, right, we're suspending Dublin 3. We're not interested. We are not taking part in this. They have since softened their stance and said, look, maybe people should be given a grace period in those other countries before they're sent back to a place like Hungary. Again, I have to play devil's advocate here and say you can kind of see where they're coming from. A country like Hungary, or all these southern periphery countries, those are the ports of entry for these asylum seekers. So all the burden would go onto those countries, would it not?
Well, the Dublin Convention and the other initiatives that you've mentioned, such as Schengen, were clearly part of an overall EU effort to make sure that refugee, asylum and migration issues are dealt with in a collective manner rather than a kind of individual country-by-country manner, and that's what they've been striving for. It's been less than 100% successful. One of the reasons that you've precisely pointed out is that in talking about people when they first arrive in the European Union, they arrive much more in some countries than they do in others. So, of course, a peripheral country such as Italy, Greece, or indeed Hungary, for example, are likely to encounter far larger numbers of people arriving than a country such as Germany or the United Kingdom. So when the peripheral countries say that they're getting a bad deal out of these initiatives, then one has to have some kind of empathy for their situation. Again, the whole point of the Dublin Convention, as originally introduced, was to ensure that it was clear who actually had responsibility for examining asylum requests, because in the pre-Dublin period, asylum seekers could travel around Europe lodging asylum applications in different countries simultaneously, and the situation was extremely messy. So it was, I think, a well-intentioned effort to bring some degree of order into a system, but perhaps in the current context it needs to be looked at again.
Gabor, I saw you shaking your head. I'll come back to you in a second. Just hold on one moment, because I want to get Greg's legal opinion here. I mean, when I learnt about Dublin 3 and read about Dublin 3 today, I just thought this is inherently flawed, is it not? I mean, it's the whole idea that all of this burden would go to these periphery countries when you've got the Germanys and the Frances and other countries which are probably more equipped to take more asylum seekers, don't take so much of the burden, and everything falls to the periphery.
Well, I have to say I completely agree. I think that's obviously correct. I mean, if you look at what actually happens when people enter the UK, for example, claiming asylum, it's very, very common that they will have passed through the European countries first, and the simple reason for that is because the UK is in the northwest of Europe. The Dublin system inherently places a massive strain on the peripheral countries. But you have to bear in mind the people who are entering Europe are doing so because Europe, the refugees are seeing Europe as a safe place. But they see Europe as a safe place. They're not fleeing to Greece, they're not fleeing to Italy, they're fleeing to Europe. And it just happens to be that those countries are on the edge, and that's why Italy saw 170,000 entrants last year, which is just far more than they could reasonably be expected to cope with, and that's why the system there is so under strain.
So, Gabor, why were you shaking your head before when we were talking about these periphery countries?
Because I think in principle this may be true, but if we look at the actual numbers, we see that there are loads of peripheral EU countries, also on the southern and the eastern border, which do not receive very high number of asylum seekers, and there are some of them in the center of the EU or even in northern Europe that actually receive very high numbers. So I think this needs to be a little bit more sophisticated. Just to give you an example, last year Italy registered 10 times more asylum seekers than Spain. Hungary registered 100 times more asylum seekers than neighboring Slovenia, neighboring Croatia, neighboring Slovakia, which are also border states of the EU or very close to the entry points. So it's not as simple as that. While we see that also Sweden and Germany that you mentioned have also very high number of asylum claims as compared to lots of other equally wealthy Western European or Northern European nations. So it's a bit more complicated.
Okay. So I think more complicated or more sophisticated, however we want to describe it, there is a more long-term plan to distribute migrants more evenly across the EU. That makes more sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think the response that you also quoted by the Hungarian government of Viktor Orban shows a very high level of ignorance towards these issues when we consider that one of the countries which would be most helped by such a distribution plan is actually Hungary. While in our opinion or experience in Hungary, working with refugees for many, many years, is that the government doesn't really want to hear these plans. And I'm really much afraid if not even the Hungarian government is ready to support such a plan, which government will?
Jeff, let me get your views on this idea of an expansion or evening it out more across the EU. Again, it sounds logical and it could be done on a basis of countries that can accommodate more, that can afford to accommodate more, all these things. Again, is there potential for a flawed process here? Some countries are going to say, well, we can't or we shouldn't, and, you know, we start again, don't we?
In response to the movement of people across the Mediterranean and through the Balkans into the European Union, the European Commission in the middle of May introduced something that it called the New Migration Agenda, and this was meant to be the solution to the continent's problems. Unfortunately, I don't think it was particularly well thought out. One of the components of that plan, for example, was a plan to what they said was to identify, seize and destroy the boats that were being used by migrants to come over to continental Europe. There was never any real detail provided as to how, in fact, the EU would identify, seize and destroy those boats. Similarly, this plan to redistribute refugees and other people across the continent was introduced with a great fanfare in the middle of May, but to be honest, there doesn't seem to have been a great deal of consultation with the member states, because a very significant proportion of the member states, including the UK, including Hungary and many others, came out very flatly against that proposal. So it does seem that these ideas were rushed in without sufficient consultation with the states that still have the sovereign right to say yes or no to such refugee admissions.
And, just as a final thought from me, gentlemen, the one thing which I sort of think about as we go forward is that you've got 5 other nations which are looking to enter the EU at some stage or the other. You've got Turkey and Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Iceland. This problem could perhaps only get bigger, couldn't it? My thanks to all 3 of our guests there. Gabor Gyulai in Budapest, Jeff Crisp joined us from Oxford, and Gregor Gyulai was in London. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. And thank you for watching at home. As always, we want to get your thoughts. You can contact us many different ways. You can start with our program page at aljazeera.com. You can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can hop on Twitter, tweet us using at AJ Inside Story, or me at Kamal AJE. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.